Hello, friends. We continue to answer your questions. Today's topic: a professor denies the verse, mountains protect the earth from shaking. He denies the verse by saying that most earthquakes happen where there are mountains. What do you think about this topic?
Thank you. First of all, the verse has many layers of meaning. If we look at it from the apparent meaning, let's see how this verse is interpreted in the Risale-i Nur. This verse is not about mountains preventing earthquakes. Rather, among the many functions of mountains, one specific function is that mountains were created to protect their own inhabitants from the shaking of the earth. To claim that earthquakes occur where there are mountains and to object to this verse is like the following example, not to compare or equate, of course. Suppose we say, we installed lightning rods to protect against the dangers of lightning. And then someone objects saying, no, lightning rods do not prevent lightning. On the contrary, lightning strikes more often where there are lightning rods. How accurate would such a statement be?
Well, it would be meaningless.
This statement stems entirely from a mistaken perspective. Lightning rods attract lightning and serve as a means to minimize its damage.
This is actually the whole point. So, assuming that someone who is an expert in material sciences is also qualified to speak on religious matters, and listening to them about religion is not a wise thing to do.
Now, of course, let's explain this verse. The interpretation of this verse is first found in the 25th word. It is also found in the treatise of Ayatul Kubra. There are verses like this in the Quran, verses similar to this one, about mountains, about the function of mountains. Let's look at them in their context. But the point you mentioned is very important. Just as a person goes to a doctor for an illness, and the doctor's opinion is valid regarding illness and medicine, surely no one would go to an engineer who hasn't studied medicine and sign their own death warrant. In the same way, believing the words of people who have spent their lives dealing with material matters and sciences, whose minds have become narrow regarding spiritual matters, who have become estranged from spirituality and rely only on what they see, is equivalent to killing your own faith.
It's just like going to an engineer to diagnose an illness. This is what it means.
Unfortunately, this mistake is sometimes made.
And it needs to be emphasized. Even if such a person speaks on this matter, their words should not be taken into account, because they are not an expert in this field.
These verses appear in Surah Al-Anbiya and in various other surahs. When we look at the interpretation of these, and before that, let's start with this point. There is no such thing as preventing earthquakes. In other words, earthquakes are a reality, and they happen continuously. Earthquakes or tremors play important roles and serve essential functions in the operation of the Earth's life mechanism, and they are employed by God's command. The Quran draws our attention to this by naming a surah, Surah Az-Zilzal, giving the reality of earthquakes as the name of a surah, indicating that this is a broad and comprehensive truth, and that through it, important duties are carried out on the earth. In fact, when we look at the interpretation of Surah Az-Zilzal in the Risale-i Nur, it tells us that the earth moves under command and fulfills important duties. Again, in the book Sözlü, in the interpretation of Surah Al-Baqarah, it is stated that through these tremors, the mountains serve as mothers and nurses to the soil. In the interpretation of the 74th verse of Surah Al-Baqarah, it is stated in the 20th word as follows: through the manifestations of majesty in the form of earthquakes and certain terrestrial events, large rocks from the high places of those mountains are in part broken down to become the source of vegetation, and in part remain as stones and are scattered and spread across valleys and plains. In this way they are employed in many wise purposes, such as serving as dwellings for the inhabitants of the earth, that is, as if making homes and shelters for them. In other words, through those tremors, Allah employs the mountains as a kind of soil and rock factory.
It's as if it resembles this, just like in stone quarries, where stones are extracted and used by blasting with dynamite. Allah, in a natural way, presents both the rocks and the soil from the mountains to our service through those earthquakes.
Of course, there are many more wisdoms behind this. When we look at the interpretation of verse 31 of Surah Al-Anbiya, either in the 25th word or in the exegesis in Ayat al-Kubra, it is expressed as follows: just as, in order to protect ships from shaking and to maintain their balance, masts are erected on them, so too are mountains established as treasure-filled masts for the ship of the earth. In this sense, the Quran, the miraculous expositor, proclaims this with verses such as, and the mountains as pegs, and the mountains he has firmly set, indicating that if there were no mountains, these tremors would be directly transmitted to the ship of the earth and would disturb its tranquility. It is also established by science that when energy encounters a mass, it disperses and dissipates there. When the tremors caused by the internal upheavals within the Earth and by operating that life machine reach the surface, the emergence of mountains from the ground serves a great purpose. By absorbing that energy, they prevent the tremors from being directly transmitted to the tranquility of the Earth's surface. It's as if the Earth breathes through the mountains. In fact, this meaning has become completely evident in volcanic mountains. When the energy inside the Earth is transmitted to the globe, the mountains absorb that energy, preventing and protecting against what would otherwise be a violent and continuous tremor. We can illustrate this with a simple example. Imagine a car accident. When cars collide in an accident, what does the deformation of the vehicles do to the energy and force of the impact? It absorbs it. If the vehicles did not deform when they collided, what would happen?
The people inside would be shaken.
That same force would be directly transferred to those inside. These are scientifically established facts. This is its literal meaning. Of course, it conveys many more meanings. A single verse contains many layers of meaning. In fact, this verse is in its essence a miracle, because only the one who created it in that way can proclaim this verse and teach us its wisdom. In other words, it is not as it is commonly thought. Therefore, when the energy inside the earth is transmitted to the inhabitants of the surface, the mountains absorb that energy, preventing the resulting tremors from being constant and severe, thus granting rest to the inhabitants of the earth. But sometimes what does the Almighty do? Sometimes by His command He may employ that tremor at certain distinct points. This is a separate matter. There are several movements, terrestrial activities involved in the formation of mountains. As a result, the fact that mountains are found in places where tremors are most frequent is not because they cause earthquakes, but rather mountains form in places where earthquakes are more common and serve such a function. This is a cause and effect relationship. It is important not to fall into a misconception here. However, it is only the Almighty who created and made them in this way who can inform us of this wisdom. In other words, instead of this mistaken perspective, if we say that the reason why there are many mountains where earthquakes occur is to ease the stability of the earth, to allow it to breathe, and to prevent the tremors caused by those earthquakes, then we can see the miraculous aspect of the verse. Here, approaching the verses in an emotional, rhetorical, or manipulative way and leading people astray is a grave responsibility.
Of course, to fully understand this topic, it is necessary to read those passages you just mentioned in their original context. That was a very good answer. May Allah be pleased with you. Friends, you can join study circles wherever you are, and you can download the Risale-i Nur collection to your phones for free. For now, may Allah protect you. See you soon.